And today, America welcomes into the mainstream of life all of our fellow citizens with disabilities. We embrace you for your abilities and for your disabilities.
With the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, people with disabilities are given the opportunity to achieve their dreams. However, it was not a brief or easy process to pass the ADA. Many groups of people fought for disability rights for decades before the ADA was passed in 1990. In the middle of the 20th century, the country was in the midst of great social reform, with African Americans working for civil rights and women entering the workforce in greater numbers. The disability rights movement emerged during this period, working alongside other minority groups for equal access to opportunity. Through many efforts over decades, the law was passed. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 resulted from the exploration of the Disability Rights Acts of the 1970s and 80s, the encounter between activists and the federal government, and the exchange of ideas that are represented by the titles within the ADA. The 1970s and 80s were a time of exploration and began the impactful journey of using federal laws to change the lives of people with disabilities. Section 504 in the Rehabilitation Act, passed in 1973, which was known as the Civil Rights Act for Disabled People, prohibited discrimination based on a person's disabilities. This was the first time the government recognized that when people do not have equal rights, they are seen as, quote, less of a person, which often leads to discrimination. Section 504 gave rise to what the ADA would later become. Then, in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, or EAHCA, was passed. As this quote illustrates, the discrimination that people with disabilities faced in schools was now being recognized. The EAHCA was crucial because public services are one of the main focuses of the ADA. First introduced in 1984, the Civil Rights Restoration Act, or CRRA, was passed in 1988. The CRRA overturned the Grove City College v. Bell Supreme Court decision.
The problem in the case was that the Grove City College had a number of students whose tuition was being paid with federal grants. And Title IX of the Education and Amendment, it provides that any program or activity that is receiving federal funds may not discriminate on the basis of sex.
The CRRA regained federal rights and protection for minority groups, including people who are disabled. Many minority groups were involved in efforts to overturn the Grove City College v. Bell ruling. These various minority groups worked together for a common goal which created connections between these groups. In addition to these collaborative efforts, the CRRA itself furthered the rights of people with disabilities. All these group efforts and acts illustrate the idea of exploration in this new movement and were the foundation of the ADA. Next, the community further worked for the cause, thus resulting in encounters with the federal government. In September of 1988, there was a hearing held for the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy and the House Subcommittee on Select Education. The hearing started off with multiple personal stories of people with all different types of disabilities, such as Down syndrome, deafness, blindness, and even those with HIV infection. Activists spoke about the discrimination and injustices they face in their lives. Even though the acts of the 1970s and 80s helped those with disabilities, there were still injustices they faced daily. In order to gain their rights, they held hearings to pass a new act, which would later become the ADA. Here, Senator Tom Harkin is thanking everyone who worked for the passing of the ADA and what it means to him in the future. Harkin delivered this speech on July 13, 1990. His brother Frank is deaf, and this speech is the first delivered in American Sign Language on the Senate floor. All these activists' abundant efforts over the previous 2 decades resulted in many opportunities for those with disabilities, but many, like Senator Harkin, furthered their endeavors and brought the cause to the federal government to pass the ADA. However, not all advocates of the act traveled to Washington, D.C. Thousands of people worked in their communities and towns. There were demonstrations for transportation and employment. Here, 13 to 14 demonstrators are protesting their access to public transportation in front of MC New Jersey Transit buses. They held signs of their desire for equality on public buses. Even though these people did not directly encounter the federal government, they did encounter the obstacle of gaining their rights, which could not be received until the law was nationally passed. All these protests and lobbying were essential in the passing of the ADA. Finally, after all the efforts, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed on July 26, 1990. The exchange of ideas that went into creating the act are represented through the main sections in it. There are 5 sections, which are employment, public services, public accommodations, telecommunications, and miscellaneous provisions. The different titles represent the ideas and compromise that went into creating the act. For example, Title I of the ADA, which focuses on employment, states that it is illegal to discriminate in hiring, firing, and promotions for people with disabilities. Employers are additionally required to make reasonable accommodations also for people with disabilities. When signing the ADA, George H.W. Bush remarked that the act will benefit businesses. The creators of the act secured employment rights for the disabled and at the same time creating value to businesses and employers. In the early 1990s, soon after the ADA became law, Prof Tech, an office supply store, hired a young woman, Patricia DeMart, as a data clerk. She is deaf. Not only is this an opportunity for her, but she's an asset to the company and to the people working there. As illustrated in President Bush's remarks, both sides of the spectrum are put at an advantage. The compromise and collaboration clearly illustrates the exchange of ideas that went into the creation of the ADA. This is also exhibited in the public services section.
And so it is time that our government recognize our abilities and give us the dignity to do what we can do.
After his diagnosis with epilepsy, everyone saw Mr. Coelho differently. He was treated as if he was less of a person. However, the ADA sections dealing with public accommodations in addition to employment allow him and anyone else to contribute to society just as much as someone without a disability. Without their full inclusion into American society, people and business are put at a disadvantage. The ADA tears that barrier away and allows both sides to benefit. To conclude, the exploration of the acts that were passed and lobbied for in the 1970s and 80s opened a path for the disability rights movement. Through the encounters between activists and the federal government, the disability rights movement continued to grow. Finally, the titles within the ADA represent the compromise and decisions, the exchange of ideas that created this law. Through the efforts of thousands of people, their ideas, their lobbying, their advocacy, the ADA was passed, thus providing equal opportunity for people with disabilities, opening the door for so many people and enabling them to achieve their goal.